Hello, and welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. I am Deanne Deacle. I'm the senior librarian. Just a quick reminder for everyone to silence their cell phones. Before we begin today, I want to remind you all that we will be wrapping up this season's Writer Series next Tuesday with author and music industry executive Nabil Ayers. Nabil will discuss his memoir, My Life in the Sunshine, about his journey to connect with his father, music legend Roy Ayers, and redefine what family really means. And as always, the first 200 attendees will receive a free copy of Nabil's book. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize those that have made today's event possible, and through whose support we've been able to bring you an incredible lineup of writers over the past few months. This free series is brought to our community by the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival Foundation and is made possible by a generous gift from Jordan Schnitzer, funded by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation. Thank you, Jordan. I'd also like to recognize the man whose vision and work have made the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival into what has become known as our nation's premier event for top authors and journalists, featuring conversations and ideas found nowhere else. Please help me recognize and say thank you to Rancho Mirage Writers Festival founder, Jamie Kabler. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Leading today's discussion with Lis Smith is local leader Will Rollins. Will graduated from Dartmouth and Columbia Law School before working as a federal prosecutor focusing on counterterrorism and counterintelligence cases in Southern California, and recently ran for Congress to serve our state's 41st district. Lis Smith is a veteran of 20 political campaigns. She has extensive experience in public affairs, media relations, and crisis communications at the local, state, and national levels. She most recently worked as a senior advisor in communications to presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. As one of his first staffers, she oversaw the campaign's communications operation, messaging, and debate prep. Politico described her as the hard-charging New York operative who helped turn an obscure Indiana mayor into a national name. Prior to working on Buttigieg's campaign, she worked on campaigns for everyone from President Barack Obama to Senator Claire McCaskill and Governor Andrew Cuomo. She has served as an on-air commentator for MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and CBS, and has had opinion pieces published in the New York Times and Vanity Fair. Any Given Tuesday, A Political Love Story is her first book. Please help me welcome to the stage Will Rollins and Lis Smith.
All right. Well, it is very appropriate that we are having this conversation on a Tuesday. Right?
I didn't even think about that, yeah.
It is Any Given Tuesday.
Yes.
And it's sunny and beautiful outside. So
I know, lucky me. I sort of planned this as part of my spring break. And then, of course, I wake up this morning and it's pouring rain. But I am still thrilled to be here. I was not expecting this many people, so thank you so much for turning out.
Well, and thank you, Jamie Kabler, for having us in the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. I'm really happy to be here. And Lis, it is great to share the stage with the greatest political strategist of my generation. So,
thank you.
I want to start actually by asking you something that you write in your acknowledgments section at the end, which is you say there are two things that you thought you would never do in life. You would never write a book, and you would never run for office.
Yes.
So when are you running for office?
Yes, so, well, never. But then again, never say never. But with writing a book, to be charitable, like I have the sort of ADD that like no man-made medication can control, and anyone who's read my book knows I've led a fairly frenetic lifestyle. I moved job to job, town to town every year. So the thought of sitting down at a computer and having this regimented writing schedule was just like, just something I couldn't understand. But then, like a lot of people, Pete dropped out of the race in March 2020. 2 weeks later, the whole world shuts down. And I was approached about writing a book, and I was like, oh, no way. But, after a week of sitting on my couch, I tried to take up knitting, and that lasted for approximately 10 seconds, because I don't know if anyone has tried to knit with 2 cats in the house. So that didn't work out. But like everyone else, I am watching the news every day, and I'm watching Donald Trump's briefings, Anthony Fauci's briefings, Andrew Cuomo's briefings. I'm getting calls from all my friends asking me what is going on. And it was really one of those moments when you realize politics touches all of us, touches everything in our lives, whether we like it or not. And with all the people calling me, I got to realize, I had a story to tell, and that there's so much work that needs to be done by people like me to demysticize the political process, to make it more accessible for people so they understand what the incentives are, what the good, the bad, the ugly is. And so that's what I set out to do with this book, is to really explain politics, and not to do one of those self-sanitized, self-glorifying books where you're the hero in every room. You're, Jared Kushner, and you single-handedly solved Israel-Palestine. And I knew that it wouldn't be credible, one, if I did that, but you'd be missing out on, the truth. And so I decided, if I'm going to torch other people, I'm going to take a blowtorch to myself as well. And I tried to be very candid about my victories in life, and also, sort of the lower points in both my personal and professional life.
You talk about being a woman in politics for 20 years, and I've heard you say before that you hope that this book is a message to young women who want to get into politics. So what do you think that our system can do to help encourage young women to get into politics and to have the kind of success that you have had?
Right. Well, that was one of the factors that went into writing this. Is, there have been great sort of behind-the-scenes books by male political operatives, male politicians. A couple books that really inspired me when I was writing this were David Axelrod's book, Believer, and George Stephanopoulos' book, All Too Human, especially that one. It was great, about his time at the Clinton White House. But there wasn't one that told the story of being like a woman behind the scenes. And, to your question, I think what can help more women get involved is if you see more women like me in leadership roles. When I was growing up, there weren't a lot of women in campaign leadership like there is now. There are more now. We have a lot of work to be done. And, one thing I talk about a lot is I loved the documentary, The War Room, when I was growing up. It's one of the reasons why I got involved in politics. And, you've got these big, larger-than-life characters, the rakish James Carville, who is just like a quote machine. You've got George Stephanopoulos. But the only woman in that whole documentary who gets extended airtime is Jennifer Flowers. And, that's not how it should be. And so I wanted to write a story that's true, but where the woman is the protagonist, and to show young women that they could, one day be a campaign manager, or a senior advisor, or a senior strategist. But another thing that we need to do, too, is to lift up women candidates. We know that traditionally women candidates get less support from party organs. They have a harder time asking for money. They're less likely to have the sort of professional contacts that you need to raise money. And so in the Democratic Party, because we like to put ourselves forward as a party, party of women, is that we need to lift up women candidates and put our money where our mouth is, make sure that we're supporting women talent, people like me behind the scenes, but also supporting women candidates.
You mentioned The War Room,
yeah.
a documentary that came out in 1992
yeah.
and peaked, or 1993, I think, just after maybe the election, piqued your interest in politics. Can you talk a little bit about how that documentary influenced your own path into politics?
Yeah. So, I know it's completely normal for a 8-9-year-old to get obsessed with a documentary about behind the scenes of politics and decide then to base the rest of their life trajectory on that. But that really is sort of what happened with me. And I think what drew me to it was, again, a lot of what you saw in politics was like the stuff that politicians wanted you to see. It was their ads, or it was highly produced television interviews or town halls or whatever it was. But the war room sort of took you behind the scenes. The politicians weren't the focus of it. It was the characters like James Carville. It was people like George Stephanopoulos. And you got to see how a campaign worked. And you got to see these people just going out and like dropping everything in their life to fight for these candidates, this candidate that they believed in. And I thought it showed, yes, a lot of the tactics, the brass knuckles part, right, where you're figuring out, are we allowed to cuss here? Or you're figuring out like sort of how to rat fuck your opponents, and sort of deal with the attacks that are coming your way. But you realize, like, it's not just all a game, right? Your heart and soul goes into these campaigns. It goes into them for a reason. Campaigns matter. They're not just a game. It's not just about winning. It's about helping elect people you believe in, because you know that they're the ones who are most likely to change people's lives for the better. And so that sort of balance, I think, of being in this fun, competitive atmosphere, but also in a business that was so high stakes and matters so much for people's lives, the second I saw that, I just knew this was the life for me.
And I mean, could you have imagined that 20 years after that documentary came out, which featured a rapid response room for the Clinton campaign, you would end up directing President Obama's rapid response team in 2012?
No, it was crazy. It wasn't lost on me when I got offered that job, how, I can't say I planned it all perfectly, but that it had sort of worked out that way. But, I talk about that in my book, and I say that I was like a pig in shit when I was offered this job. Because, I grew up, I'm a twin, I have a twin brother, and anyone who knows twins knows that there is like this sort of weird dynamic between twins. Sometimes people call twins emotional terrorists. But I like to think that growing up we'd go tit for tat on everything. We always had a quip for each other. We were competitive about our grades, our performances in sports, et cetera, et cetera. And so when they called me and offered me a job of just like terrorizing Mitt Romney every day, I was like, I can't even believe I get paid to do this. Yeah.
So tell the story about how you ended up terrorizing him once with a news reporter in Ohio, because and talk a little bit about why you ended up going to that TV reporter in Ohio, because of how reporters cover presidential campaigns and how that sort of has shifted over the years, and Stockholm Syndrome, as you describe it in your book.
Yeah. So I got started on the Obama campaign in January of 2012, and that was when you still had a raging primary. Sorry, did I say 2012? January of 2012. And there was this assumption that Mitt Romney was going to wrap up the nomination pretty early, go on and run unscathed as the general election nominee. It didn't quite play out that way. Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum ended up running pretty spirited campaigns. So as long as they were in the race, my job was to try to get Mitt Romney locked into as many unpopular far-right positions as possible. Probably sounds, like something you hear every day now. As much as things change, they really do stay the same in politics. So the big issue du jour was whether employers would be required to cover birth control, regardless of their political and religious beliefs. And there was a bill in the U.S. Senate that would allow employers to opt out of covering birth control because of their religious and political beliefs. And we knew that if Mitt Romney adopted this position, that would be very, very hurtful to him in a general election. But if he repudiated that, it would be very harmful to him in a Republican primary. So he was in a no-win position. And I called all the reporters who were on the Romney plane and trying to say, hey, this is a really big issue. It is raging in Washington, D.C. You need to get Mitt Romney on the record about this. Now, none of the reporters would ask him about it. And that's where this sort of Stockholm Syndrome thing comes in. And that is that a lot of people who only have sort of glancing knowledge of how this works might not be aware of this, but the way that big news organizations, whether it's TV networks or big newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, the way that they cover presidential campaigns is that they have very, very young reporters. They're called campaign embeds, and they fly around with the candidates. And whether they rise or fall and whether they get access or not largely depends on their relationship with the candidates and with their staff. And so it creates sort of a Stockholm Syndrome dynamic where they're afraid to challenge the candidate. They're afraid to rock the boat. And they become sort of captive to them, where they think, okay, one, if the fate of their candidate if their candidate's doing better, they're more likely to get airtime. They're more likely to get stories written. So in a primary, there's not a ton of incentive for you to write negative stories about them because you want them to succeed because that's good for your career. But then there's also a thing where, you're with these people all the time. You're eating with them, you're drinking with them, you're on the plane with them, and you don't really want to challenge them, and you sort of start to identify with them. So getting these people to do their jobs and ask the tough questions is really hard. And they're much more likely to ask about, hey, what's your reaction to this poll that no one's gonna, care at all about in a week or remember in a week. So I got my first big break on the Obama campaign when I'm checking Twitter and I see this Ohio reporter, Jim Heath, at ONN. It's like this regional cable network, not a lot of viewers. He tweets, just scored a last-minute sit-down with Mitt Romney. Any questions you want? I'm like, oh my God. So I pick up the phone, I start calling him, I'm emailing him, I'm texting him. Finally I get him and I'm on the phone with him. I'm like, check your email. I just sent you this stuff. It's really, really good. And he's like, okay, I'm about to sit down with him. I'll take a look. How I knew Jim Heath was I had worked on Ted Strickland, the governor of Ohio's campaign in 2010. I was his communications director. And I'd struck up a friendship with Jim Heath. We would watch Monday Night Football together because we lived in the same apartment building. And, we had a really good reporter-flack relationship. And just because of that one relationship I had, I was able to get Mitt Romney on the record on this. And probably most people have memory hold this by now, but Mitt Romney at first said, I disagree with Marco Rubio and Roy Blunt on this. I think that birth control should be covered. Within a few minutes, though, then you have the right wing. Everyone's saying, oh my God, this is a betrayal by Mitt Romney. Then Mitt Romney, in the course of minutes, flip-flops and says, actually, I do agree with this. So, right, that's like Mitt Romney in a nutshell. But so in the course of an hour, he managed to piss off the moderates and then piss off the far right, and so no one position. It ended up being on the evening news, trickling out, being in the New York Times, Washington Post, etc. But it was an anecdote that tells you a lot about how reporter-flack relationships matter and why it's important for people like me to have good relationships with reporters, maybe sometimes forged over Monday Night Football, and why, and also the changing nature of the media system. And right. I think we'll probably talk about that, yeah.
Right, because you ended up finding out about this interview on Twitter.
Yeah.
Something that certainly didn't exist in '92 when CNN was the only cable news network, really major cable news network in the United States. And so talk a little bit about how you've seen the media landscape change during your career and how social media in particular and things like Twitter have affected politics, and for better or for worse.
Yeah, well, so that was the first election where Twitter really was a factor. And we were better than the Romney campaign at using it to our advantage, and I was really on the sort of front lines of figuring out how to use that to our advantage on the Obama campaign. And traditionally how it worked was, in my role on the campaign, rapid response meant that I had to watch every Mitt Romney event, every Paul Ryan event, and come up with the campaign's response to it. Generally how that would work is they give a speech, an hour later you send a statement, or you call the reporters on the phone, or long before that you would fax a statement. But now what I realized is that you could sort of short circuit things using Twitter. And you didn't have to wait until after events. So for instance, there were events where, where an endorser of his went up and called Barack Obama like a Muslim or a terrorist or something like that, right? And Mitt Romney, instead of doing what John McCain did in 2008 when he had a supporter say that at an event and John McCain very forcefully condemned the supporter, Mitt Romney refused to say anything. And so then I could immediately put something out on Twitter and say, like, wow, Mitt Romney refuses to condemn this. And then that becomes the headline of the event, not Mitt Romney talking about how he wants to create jobs in Ohio. And it helped us show that you could really use Twitter to sort of hijack the news cycle. Now, that was some way that we could use it to our advantage, but there are some downsides to it. There were a lot of times when reporters would tweet out quotes that were inaccurate and would go halfway around the world before they were corrected, or times when reporters would tweet things that were out of context. Unfortunately, we talked about how sort of the 24-hour news cycle sort of destroyed news, but like Twitter has made it even worse because now it's not just like, oh, what's happening every day. It's like reporters and candidates who respond to these minute-by-minute incentives to always say something outrageous, to always be breaking news. And I do think that it has changed incentives in the news business in a negative way, where there is more an incentive on covering conflict, on getting like scoops, no matter how big or small. And sometimes lost in all of that are the really big issues, the meaty issues, the substantive issues, the things that actually matter to people's lives. And because they're just, it takes too many words to explain.
Right. And I mean, I want to fast forward a bit because, spoiler alert, President Obama won in 2012.
Yes.
But by 2016, you were doing some commenting on networks.
Yeah.
And I want to read a quote that I liked and asked you sort of to expand on this a little bit, because I think it's a great commentary on our current, not just social media infrastructure, but cable news infrastructure. And you write, quote, in 2016, outrage was especially in demand, and I found myself regularly pandering to the lowest common denominator and making assertions I would never have made in a strategy meeting or even over dinner. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's affected cable news in the way that our landscape is now?
Yeah, and I mean, you've done cable news, so you understand this, is that when people go on cable news, generally you see them book someone on the left and someone on the right, and before you go on, they sort of try to pre-screen what you're going to say because they want the person on the left to say, something that's like really hot and outragey on the left, and you want the person on the right to say something that's really hot and outragey on the right because you want these like fireworks. And so it ends up, there's a sort of a performance aspect to cable news, and I think that some of that stuff there's a performance aspect to it, but that a lot of this has, and I think it's a bigger problem in cable news in general, where different outlets really cater to their audiences in a way that they're telling them what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And that's how you can have people, who only listen to or watch right-wing outlets think that, the election was stolen, or that people who only watch or listen to left-wing outlets think that, Donald Trump is a Russian agent or whatever. And it's really destructive because it's in their business interest to foment conflict and to only elevate the most extreme of voices, and it has a very distorting effect on our politics because most people in politics aren't on the far left or aren't on the far right. They're somewhere right in the middle, and so a lot of the voices and opinions that you hear on air don't really reflect where most people are, but it does contribute to a lot of incentives. Then, if you're a politician, if you're on the left and if you're a Democrat and you want to get on cable news, you got to say some crazy shit, and you're more likely to get booked on MSNBC or any lefty network if you say defund the police than if you say we need common sense criminal justice reform, And same with on the right wing, there are more incentives to say crazy things, and I do think that's a problem, and it's something that's only getting worse over time.
Do you think that there is maybe a business model that can succeed without doing that in the modern landscape? Because it seems really, really challenging financially, and certainly the death of a lot of print journalism, I think, maybe foreshadow this. Do you think we can do something about it? I
would love to think there is. I just haven't seen a model that works. And, you see it increasingly now that people on the Democrats, calling the New York Times right wing, which is just insane, And because people really just want to hear things that reinforce their worldviews, and increasingly among the consumers of news, they just want to hear what they want to hear. And so in some ways, media organizations are shaping the opinions of their consumers, but in some ways they're responding to what their consumers want. And what their consumers want is, like chicken soup for the soul, not anything that's going to challenge their worldview. So it is really hard to see if news organizations are reliant on subscriptions and things like that. It's really hard to see them really trying to go right down the middle when people tend to pay for things that reinforce their worldviews.
Right. I think you've been ahead of the curve in advising a lot of candidates on media and comms. Are there any trends that you see developing now that you think are really encouraging, at least in the media, maybe from a pro-democracy standpoint and a pro-informed public, or worrisome that you think could continue to trend worse in the next few years?
Yeah, look, I think it's the willingness of the media to call bullshit. Bullshit is good, right? When and it was really tough for reporters covering Donald Trump, because this is a guy, like him or hate him, like, you got to admit that this is someone who spews out a lot of falsehoods, right? And sometimes in less than a minute will spew out a lot of them. And whether you think that they are malicious or just, part of his persona, he does do that. And so there was this delicate dance at the beginning of his presidency. Well, do you call a lie a lie? And a lot of reporters were afraid to do that. But now what we've seen is, with both people on the left and right, that reporters are more likely to call balls and strikes. And I think that's a good thing, versus just saying, this person said X, this person said Y, and giving them both equal weight. In terms of bad things, again, we talked about some of the polarization in media. I think, I think that is bad. And one thing I try to do in my job is for my mental health, I try not to watch a lot of cable news. And that was something I learned early on in the pandemic, and it was helpful, frankly, when I was writing a book, was to turn that stuff off, because it does drive a lot of anxiety. But when I do watch it, I try to have a regular diet. I go to MSNBC, I go to CNN, I go to Fox to see, what the different viewpoints are on each of them and how they're covering the news, because it's helpful for me to see. But it's different worlds, man, when you're watching that stuff. And it's wild how you can get these are news organizations, but you're getting totally different versions of the news from them watching them. So I think that's a problem. Another problem that exists and that we hear about ad nauseum is the death of local media. That really matters in local governance. It matters, you're not going to find out about corruption on the local level. You're not going to find out about a lot of these things if the local media is dead. And then when the local media dies, where do we think these folks are going to get their media? They're going to the very polarized national outlets that are tearing our country apart. So there are a lot of consequences for the death of local media. And there are some models we've seen across the country of sort of nonprofits trying to step in and build up news organizations in states where the local media has been decimated. But that's going to be really, really important in the coming years. Because otherwise, that's why in states like Ohio, you have this massive corruption scandal in the state house. And there are a lot of signs that this was afoot before, and I think some of them were missed because there wasn't a lot of local media to hold politicians accountable.
I want to fast forward from 2016. Spoiler alert: Donald Trump won that one. To 2020, where you had a lot of success penetrating the right-wing bubble in media with Secretary Pete.
Yeah.
And before I ask you about sort of the strategy behind that, can you share the story about how you first heard of Pete Buttigieg and what your reaction was to learning about him?
Yes, so I remember I was sitting at home. It was I think right before Christmas in 2016, Donald Trump had just won, and I got an email out of the blue from someone being like, hey, you've got to check out this guy, Pete Buttigieg. He's running for DNC chair. And I remember my first reaction was oof, tough name. And, as if that mattered. Sometimes, in politics you do things sort of superficially like that. But then I remember thinking like, okay, whatever. And I just started Googling him, and I just like fell down this rabbit hole. I read all the stories about him. I watched all the YouTube videos of his press conferences, interviews, and there's just something I found so mesmerizing and compelling about him, because he was just like, you know, he's 34 years old, but like so calm and so mature and like so self-possessed. And I was like, where has this guy been my entire life? And so, you know, it goes to show that maybe sometimes your, you know, first instinct isn't the right one, but obviously it ended up being a pretty fruitful relationship.
Well, and you did your homework before you agreed to work with him, because you wanted to get a read on, quote, his douche factor. And this is the quote. I want to read your quote really quick, and then you can talk a little bit about it. But you said, quote, "To my jaded political mind, no one could be 34 years old, floated in the New York Times as the first gay president, named as one of 4 future voices of the Democratic Party by Barack Obama, and not be a douche." How did he convince you otherwise in that first call?
Yeah, I know, right? Well, just like, because when you see that resume, it had strong vibes of, you know, that kid in class who's always like, me, runs for student body president, wins. And so I was afraid that there are going to be strong like vibes like that. But no, it was just the opposite. And, you know, when I first talked with him, when I first sat down with him, I remember, you know, when I was writing my book, I went back and like listened to the audio of my first media prep with him. And like at some point in the audio, when doing media prep, you can like sort of hear me giggle. Like, and I'm not like a big giggler, but it was like because I was like just like shocked, like who is this guy? He's running for DNC chair. Why did he just like change my mind on like, I don't know, the Middle East or something like that? And what I found so compelling about him at that time was, you know, there had been a long trend in politics, certainly, you know, post Bush's victory in 2000, sort of a dumbing down of politics, where like you know, people were told not to be intellectual, not to be wonky, not to be thoughtful. You know, like when John Kerry was running for president in 2004, they like, some of the oppo against him was videos of him speaking French, you know? But Pete was like very unabashedly intellectual. Like he went out there and spoke seven languages and was like proud of it. And I liked the fact that he was someone who was, you know, willing to be, you know, like outwardly smart, like, ooh, scandal. But there was... But there was also something I found really compelling about him, because, you know, if you guys remember December 2016, January 2017, there was, to put it mildly, a, you know, Democratic freak out, you know, after Trump won. Because we were like, what did we miss? What did we get wrong? Maybe we didn't attack him enough. And there was this view that to beat Trump, we had to be Trump. And so you saw a lot of Democratic voices on cable going out and being yelly, screamy, calling everyone a racist, misogynist, homophobe, whatever, you know, and finding the most over-the-top language to use. And that's how you had people like Michael Avenatti, you know, become huge, because there was this view that to beat Trump, you had to be Trump. And what Pete and I realized early on in that race, even though he wasn't running for president then, though that's when the seed was planted, was that, no, that was the wrong way to look at it. That to beat Trump, actually, you had to be the antidote to Trump. And that's really what Pete offered to me, was sort of an antidote to all the yelly, screamy, outrage-driven politics. Someone who was, even though just 34, 35 years old, was the adult in the room.
So Pete he lost his race for DNC chair.
Yeah.
But, of course, he comes back in 20, and you eventually agree to work on his presidential campaign as well. And as I think you write in your book, no money, no name ID.
Yeah.
The conventional wisdom would have been no chance. So how did you confront that conventional wisdom at the beginning of that race? There were a lot of people who'd already announced who were much better known than Pete. What was the strategy, and how did you think through that at the beginning?
Yeah, so, well, actually, I ended up staying with him after the DNC chair race. He lost the DNC chair race. But a funny thing you learn if you're involved in DNC politics at all is that the only loser of the DNC chair race is the person who wins it, because then they have to be a DNC chair. And, that was the only campaign I've worked on where I got a losing bonus. So I stuck around with Pete, and right after he dropped out of that, I raised with him the crazy possibility, maybe you should run for president. And because we'd just seen he was able to tap into something, I just knew that he had a message, and sort of the way he carried himself, his bio, it's something that could connect. Now, flash forward. When he decides he's going to run for president, people thought he was crazy. And when I told my friends that I was going to turn down, bigger names to work for him, one of my friends was like, did you lose a bet or something? And I was like, no, I really believe in this guy. I really think that he could go somewhere. But, of course, he was 37-year-old mayor of a town of 100,000 people, openly gay. So not exactly like a traditional background. He had that tough last name, no national fundraising base. So how could we rise? And the one thing that I realized that we had in our arsenal was something that everyone else had access to, and that was to free media, to the press. And that that our only way to rise was by him going out in the media as much as possible, saying yes to as many interviews as we could, and having him knock it out of the park. Now, this isn't a strategy that would work for everyone. This is not a strategy, that would work, for Joe Biden, for instance. You don't want to throw him on TMZ or Barstool Media or, the Breakfast Club or whatever it is. You don't want to put him in the mosh pit with 100 reporters around him. He's just not that type of person. He's got plenty of other skills that make up for that. But it was something that was sort of, and I don't want, this pains me a little bit, but I do have to give a little bit of credit to Donald Trump, because it was something I learned from watching the 2016 campaign, which is you saw him go out and just basically do every interview that came his way. And I'm not saying that he would knock them all out of the park. Sometimes he would just absolutely bomb in them. He did this Washington Post Ed Board meeting where he talked about the size of his hands 35 times in it, just defending it. And if you go back and read the transcript, it is incredible. But why did none of these things stick? Why did none of these things stick? It's because every day he was going out and flooding the zone with a new interview or some new outrage or some new completely abhorrent thing, so that none of the gaffes could really stick, and he just kept the news cycle rolling. And so nothing negative really stuck about him, but two, it also blotted out the sun for everyone else, because everyone was just covering the Donald Trump show. On the other side, you had Hillary Clinton, who really restricted access to the media. And so that when she went out, so one, it created this cat and mouse dynamic where the media was sort of then out to ask her tough questions and trying to get her to mess up. But two, it created this dynamic that when she did mess up, if she did have a gaffe, because she wasn't filling the news cycle with anything else for weeks afterwards, it meant that the gaffe could really sink in. And a really bad answer about her emails or whatever it was could really take hold with the American voters. So we wanted to emulate Donald Trump's strategy, but obviously with a very different messenger and very different messages. And so I tried to make it so that no matter where you went or what you listened to, you were going to hear from Pete Buttigieg. And so, yes, we did have him talk to the traditional news outlets, but, as I mentioned as well, I had him on, sports outlets. I had him on, talking to gossip outlets like TMZ, to fashion outlets like Vogue. And, when you think about Pete Buttigieg, sports, celebrity, fashion are not the first three things that come to mind. I had him being profiled in Playboy, and he's a scripture-quoting gay man, so you wouldn't exactly think that's his actual audience. But
that was a great article, by the way.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. But what we saw is that if you do work for someone, or if you are someone who has something compelling to say, you're willing to go out there and not just say the usual pablum and talking points that other people do, and if you're willing to engage with the interviewers and say something interesting, that you can really break out in the media. And that was how we had that early success, was not just by putting him on everything, but making sure he was always saying something interesting when he was going out there.
And he had some enormous breaks during these phenomenal performances, in particular after a town hall that I think he did on CNN right early. And then he did another amazing town hall on Fox News with Wallace.
Chris Wallace,
Chris Wallace, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the prep that goes into something like that, and how was it so unique to have a candidate capable of hitting it out of the park like that, or was he willing to work harder than you'd seen anybody work before?
It was a combination of both. It was both natural skill. You know, I think most people in here have probably seen his interviews, and I mean, he's in the Democratic Party our best person on TV because he's very, you know, his brain operates like a computer, and like to the extent that one time I was getting feedback on a debate. One of his debate performances, and one of the top, you know, Democratic strategists like called me and was like, Liz, you know, you need to get him to pause before he answers because it's like he's answering too fast. And it's like, just because that's how his brain worked, but like generally, like you try to make people seem like smarter than they are, but it's like people were telling me to try to make him seem dumber than he was to make him more relatable. But for instance, for the CNN town hall, we did a ton of prep, and I mean, that was when our campaign was like 4 staffers. It was a month and a half after he announced his exploratory committee, and we realized, okay, he's got 1 hour of national TV. This is like a make or break moment for him, and we've just got to have a couple viral moments, and what could they be? So we prep, we go through all the issues, we go through all the answers, making sure he knows, you know, the latest with what's going on in domestic and foreign policy, yada, yada, yada. And then the day before the CNN town hall, he did an interview with Anna Marie Cox at South by Southwest. And I heard him start to give this answer about Mike Pence and calling out Mike Pence for being a hypocrite. And like, how can you call yourself this Christian when you're going out and you're like, you know, prostrating yourself for this guy who paid hush money to a porn star? And I was like, light bulb went off. And I pulled him aside afterwards. I was like, I think that's it. I think that is going to be the viral moment. And so we sort of workshopped it a little bit. He doesn't like to prepare stuff too much because if you do that, you can really tell, you know, when you're listening to a debate and someone lands a line that sounds like super canned and it just doesn't land right. But he was like, okay, I got it. So he went out, he did that, and he was asked about Mike Pence. He got asked a question by someone in the audience about it. And then Jake Tapper followed up, and he just delivered this just amazing, just like beautiful, like smackdown of Mike Pence, where he's like wraps in like Pence's hypocrisy, Christian hypocrisy. He quotes scripture. It's just got like every beautiful component, right? And he delivers it like, you know, in the aw shucks Mayor Pete way. So it doesn't sound like, you know, like he's taking like a blowtorch to Mike Pence's face, which he essentially was. And what was crazy was afterwards, a CNN producer came to the green room and showed us, okay, so there'd been 2 town halls before Pete's and showed us like the engagement online. And it's like this. And then you get to the Mike Pence moment, and it's like, boom, up like that. And I remember Pete's in the green room afterwards, and we're all like, oh, we're like cheering like it's a Super Bowl, like screaming, and I remember just hearing him under his breath being like, Jesus, Oprah just texted me. and like, we had been afraid. There was this requirement to be on the Democratic debate stage that you had to have 65,000 donors, and we in the first quarter, and we did not think we would get anywhere near that. I think up to the point of that moment, we had 13,000 donors. Within 40 hours, we'd hit 65,000. Like within 48 hours, it was like 100,000. We had set a goal for that quarter of raising $1 million, and in 48 hours, we raised $1 million. We ended up raising $7 million that quarter. And the next quarter, he ended up raising $24 million, which was the most out of any presidential candidate. But it does show you how one moment, just one really good moment, if you really plan it out well and have a candidate who is really prepared to do it, that can really change everything. And like, I talk about the campaign as, you know, pre-CNN town hall and post-CNN town hall. That's how much it meant for us.
So another part of your strategy, which I didn't know about till reading the book, was modeled on the Straight Talk Express, which you unsuccessfully lobbied to get changed to the Gay Talk Express.
I did. Pete didn't like that one, yeah.
But talk a little bit about the decision to model your campaign's tour in Iowa on that the successful McCain effort, nearly, I guess it had been 20 years prior.
Yeah, and that's where you can see, like, being sort of someone like me, who I was a political nerd. I really did study this stuff, whether it was the War Room or the Straight Talk Express, which was happening, when I was in high school. That, I tried to absorb things that I saw other people doing in politics, learn from them, and build on them. And so after Pete had this moment, he went viral. He, was near the top of these polls. He sort of plateaued over the summer of 2015. And he sort of lost the joy in the campaign. He then was like running fourth in Iowa and New Hampshire, fourth or fifth. He had a couple debate performances that were good, serviceable, not really breakout performances. And like, the thing that hurt me the most was like, not that people were writing negative things about him. It was like, they just weren't writing about him at all. So I realized like he needed to get his mojo back. We needed to get a spark back in the campaign. So I convinced Pete and I convinced the campaign to let me do a modern day version of the Straight Talk Express. We never settled on a name for the bus. As Will mentioned, I did lobby to, tongue-in-cheek, to call it the Gay Talk Express, but Pete rolled his eyes at that. And, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Straight Talk Express, that was what was credited with McCain's rise in the 2000 campaign, which is McCain was someone who was very good with the media. He had an amazing reputation with the media. He was seen as this maverick, this straight talker, someone who could be chummy with them in a way that, someone like George Bush, who had $1 gazillion but couldn't really, interact with the press, didn't have. So he used that to maximize his press coverage, get him out there, and he was, a very likable guy with a really compelling bio, so it worked in his advantage. And so Pete had a lot of those things. He was good with the media. He said interesting things. I knew he was quick on his feet. So we decided to resurrect that. But things had changed. Back in 2000, you didn't have like Wi-Fi at the time. You didn't have Twitter. So people couldn't be putting out like every utterance and every gaffe of yours. They would have to wait hours to file something. And by that time, the world has moved on. So some people thought I was absolutely crazy, and I mean, I am, like a little bit crazy at least. But like with Pete, he always had this attitude that nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so we did that. And we put, every media outlet, every national media outlet plus local outlets on the bus with him. And he would sit here, he'd have two chairs around him like this. And then all around, you would have the national networks, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, yada, yada, yada. And it just allowed them to ask him whatever questions they wanted. And at first it was super awkward, and you could really tell that reporters were just so not used to it, because they get on the bus and they're like the dog that caught the car, because like they just don't know what to ask. And it was like a really, really bad first date, is how I describe it, right? Because the conversation was so strained. It was like, hey, how did you and Liz first meet? That was literally one of the questions, right? But after a while, it loosened up, and the rapport became better, and you saw them stop getting out of asking, what about this poll? What about this poll? What about Donald Trump getting impeached? Do you think he should be impeached, right? The same questions, and you got into deeper questions about him, deeper questions about things affecting the electorate, and I thought that it led to much better, outcomes in terms of press coverage, but it also led, to a lot more press coverage. And I think that was really a crucial part of him getting his mojo back and us getting the bump, was because it undeniably led to a lot more press. And, it's a reality of what I do, is that if you want more press, you got to give press more access. And so it was a risk, but it really did pay off for us.
And you guys had booze on the bus.
Oh, we did. So I got some advice from some of the McCain people. I did my research. I called all the reporters. I called a bunch of McCain staffers, and they were thrilled that I was doing this. They thought I was crazy, but they were thrilled, and they said, most important thing, you got to feed them. You got to get them 3 square meals a day, and make sure they're good meals, right? I was like, okay. And there's like, second most important thing, you got to have booze on the bus. And so We did. We had red wine, White Claw, Bud Light, Bud Heavy, brown liquor, clear liquor. The only thing we didn't have that John McCain's Straight Talk Express had was a margarita machine. But next time.
Well, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I want to ask you quickly about 2024.
Yeah.
And first, let me just say, on any given Tuesday, the former president of the United States might be indicted.
I know. Has anyone checked their phones? It could have happened when we're up here. Yeah.
I mean, so I want to ask, how do you think the politics of that indictment would play out both on the Republican side and then in the general election?
Right. So this is the thing, is Donald Trump is someone who is, it's so frustrating to make any predictions about him because he has upended everything we thought we knew about politics. But I have noticed, I think a lot of people have noticed that in recent years, we've fallen into this pattern of when these bad catastrophic things happen to Donald Trump, instead of being like, wow, these are bad and catastrophic, we're just like, well, of course this is going to help Donald Trump, or how is this going to help Donald Trump? And I don't think that that's quite the right way to look at things either, because whether you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump, being indicted is not a positive. Being indicted is not a good thing. Now, where I could see it helping him in the short term is we're seeing that play out right now, which is it has rallied the Republican establishment around him, whether it's Kevin McCarthy or a lot of his opponents. You saw Mike Pence say he thinks it's politically driven prosecution. You saw Ron DeSantis do that also while taking a little bit of a dig at him by saying, well, I don't know what it takes to pay off hush money to a porn star who I had an extramarital affair with. That was a clever response. I'll give Ron DeSantis that. So I think it can have an effect of blotting out the sun. If you were a Republican challenger, you are not going to be getting a lot of press as long as this guy is really dominating the headlines with this. It also creates an incentive where the establishment and his opponents are sort of going to be forced to rally around him versus criticizing him, and it's going to further harden his very, very dedicated base and maybe energize them. But his base is not enough. His base might be enough to win a Republican primary, and so I think I don't know if this significantly changes his prospects in a Republican primary, but I do think in the long run that it would hurt him in a general election. Where I do think it could hurt him in a primary is that some people who might be on the fence about, I like Donald Trump, but I'm just sick of it. Too much drama. We need to win the election. I don't think it's worth taking a risk on someone who is indicted maybe once, maybe more times than that. But in a general election, I think you're going to see more of the fatigue that people had in 2020 and in 2022 when they sort of punished Trump-esque candidates at the ballot box. It's just too much drama, too much controversy, too much lawlessness for people. And, I don't think that this is an instance of 4D chess. I think that being indicted as a presidential candidate is an unambiguously bad thing. And it's just important for Democrats not to overplay their hand on it or to think that this is somehow a silver bullet. We're going to have to go out there and make this a campaign about the issues and make sure that we are talking not just about Donald Trump, but talking about the things that affect people's day-to-day lives.
So in the primary, assuming that he continues to advance through it, and we've seen a little bit of a preview of how he went after DeSantis with some of the comments yesterday, I think it was on Twitter or Truth Social, and you have a quote in your book, the George Bernard Shaw quote, "Don't wrestle with pigs, you get filthy and the pig loves it."
Yeah.
I mean, how do you approach, if you were advising some of the Republican contenders in the primary, how do you approach those kinds of attacks, and what advice would you give them in dealing with those?
Yeah, I mean, look, getting in a war of words with Donald Trump is like, getting in a fight with a chimpanzee with a machine gun. You're just you're just not going to win that one, and you have no idea what's coming your way. And so it's really, really tough because he is not a conventional opponent, and he doesn't play by the rules. And so I think sometimes, again, sort of going back to what I was saying about Mayor Pete, now Secretary Pete, is that one of the things I liked about him, and that I think was one of the reasons why he got as far as he did, was because he was offering something that was sort of an antidote to Trumpism. You know, he was someone who spoke like an adult, who didn't just rely on outrage all the time, and didn't. When Trump would attack him during the campaign, he didn't respond by yelling, screaming, you know, foaming at the mouth. Oftentimes, what he would do would just do a sly brush off and then pivot to talking about something. So, for instance, Donald Trump's first attack on Mayor Pete was calling him Alfred E. Newman. And, you know, Mayor Pete was asked about it. And he was like, honestly, I had to Google that. You know, I think, you know, I guess it's a generational thing. and it was a great response from Pete, and it's like vintage Pete, because, you know, in a very subtle way, he took a shot at Donald Trump for like being sort of old and out of touch. But he didn't sink to Donald Trump's level of insults, whatever. But then he just went to talking about something else, and or when Donald Trump was like, well, you know, yeah, could you imagine? I'd like to see him negotiating with Xi Jinping. Like Pete's response was, well, I'd like to see him negotiate with Xi Jinping. And so I think what I learned from that, and I know just from hearing from people behind the scenes, was that Donald Trump and the Trump people had a lot of respect for Mayor Pete, because he's someone who showed a lot of strength in how he responded. Strength in that he didn't take Trump's bait. And Pete always talked about Trump as like, it's like playing with a Chinese finger trap. You know, those things where the more you struggle, the more your fingers get caught. And so you just can't do that. And so I think, you know, the way to deal with him is I thought the way DeSantis dealt with it yesterday was good. He, you know, did the thing about Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, but then got a shot at Trump, but then sort of moved on. And I think with him, like, if he comes at you, like, I don't know if you guys saw Trump's posts yesterday on Truth Social, but he managed to accuse Ron DeSantis in one day of being gay while cheating on his wife and having affairs with underage students. And, like, you know, how are you going to, first of all, I mean, those are completely, you know, contradictory things, but how are you going to, you know, what's the point in responding to all of that and getting wrapped up in that? So I think what's smart is to, you know, take him on, brush him off, but then move on and really make sure you're talking about yourself and you're talking to the American people, because if you're just talking to Donald Trump, you're playing his game. And, like, you know, he really thrives when he is when he's the, you know, circus master, and you know, you can't have a circus if no one shows up to it.
So I know you probably hate this question,
yeah,
but do you want to give a prediction for 2024?
Oh my God, after 2016, I'm like sort of out of the prediction business, because I was definitely one of those people who was on cable news being like, there's a 0% chance that Donald Trump wins the election. But today, sitting here today, the most likely scenario is that Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee. I mean, I don't think anyone serious is going to challenge him, and that the most likely Republican nominee is Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that he is going to be the Republican nominee. There's a lot that can happen between now and then. It's just really hard to imagine, with his grip on the base of the Republican Party and how Republican primaries work. So, for instance, in the Democratic Party, in our primaries, if the front runner, if the winner of a primary gets 30% and the person who comes in second gets 25%, you know, delegates are awarded, you know, the first place person gets 30% of the delegates, the second place person gets 25%. In the Republican primary, you just have to win, and it's winner takes all. So Donald Trump right now is at the support level that if you have a multi-way primary, he has enough to win, and enough to win most primaries. So he'll, if that holds, you know, he should be able to win the nomination. Then my prediction is that will be the most depressing general election of all time. But, you know, it is one where, based on the last couple election cycles, that would give Joe Biden the edge.
And last question for you before we wrap. What's next for you?
You know, good question. I think as we saw in my book, I sort of let life sort of take me. And I just sort of never know what's coming next, and I just sort of go with my gut. So I don't know. I've been taking off a little bit of time after the election and book. I'm working on some new projects, but we'll see. I'm sure that it will be something very, very exciting.
Well, if anybody hasn't read Lis Smith's book, it's incredible. Go buy it now. Liz, thank you so much for doing this. Jamie, the Ransom Mirage Writers Festival, thank you. 3 o'clock. Awesome job. Awesome job.
Thank you.